Welcome back, everyone. In the last video, we migrated over the context from categories into a reducer in Redux. In this video, I want to talk about one of the new patterns that emerges because we are now working in Redux, and where I want to focus our attention to is when we call our getCategories and documents method. Typically, when we worked with our usual flow of data, we put our transformation logic inside of our utility helper in Firebase. The reason why we did this is because whenever we made the fetch statement, we knew that chances are we probably want to extrapolate this data in a format that we'll use, which was the categories map. In this video, though, I want to highlight one of the patterns that emerges with Redux, which is where you essentially pull your data, but you pull it in its most basic form. And what you do is you store that basic form of the data. So in this case, you pull just the docs as an array. And then when you store it in your reducer, essentially what you'll do is you will extrapolate the logic that transforms it into a category map into a selector. The reason for this is because our reducer, as I mentioned, should always store the most basic format. Essentially, it is the data that you get from your API. Then with a selector, what you do is you transform that data into the final shape that you want it to be. And the reason you want to do this is because you can have multiple different selectors that perform different transformations on the base format of the data you have. So imagine if we just had the array of the different collections. From here, maybe you want to select just one, or maybe you want to select multiple, or maybe you want to create a category map. Whatever option you want to pursue, by doing it this way, you're now able to extrapolate out this data into a much more targeted manner. Because now the selectors is where the logic lives, and the selector is that thing that transforms what the logic and base data you have into the final desired output. So this is a very important thing. Your selectors is where you do your transformation business logic. So what we're going to do is we're going to migrate our code over so that we follow this pattern. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to simplify the Firebase utils method that actually gave us our category map before. So here what I'm going to do is instead of generating the category map as we've done up until this point, I just want to comment this out for now so that we keep a reference to it. What I'm going to instead do is say, okay, instead I just want to return query snapshot.docs.map, because essentially we need to map out all of these documents in order for us to get the data. So what I'm going to say is doc snapshot should return doc snapshot.data like this. And now this get categories and documents will give us back the categories as an array. So before we start modifying any of our code, let's just make sure all of this is working. So inside of our shop component where we make this fetch, this is now a categories array. And before I dispatch anything, I want to console.log the categories array just to make sure that this method is now working. So let's go back here. And what happens is we refresh. We see, there we go. We get the array of our categories that we've got stored on Firebase. So now what we need to do is store this inside of our reducer, this new categories array. So what we'll do is we will tweak our category reducer in order for it to reflect accordingly. So here, what I'm going to do is instead of calling set categories map, I'm just going to say set categories. And then I need to update, of course, the actual reducer, but also the action. Because the action is now going to call set categories. And instead of passing a categories map, we're just going to pass a categories array. Now here you can be very explicit about this being categories array, like so. But either way, we're just updating this naming convention. And the name of the variable, the actual logic of the function, exact same. Nothing's changed. Inside of a reducer, of course, we want to update set categories like so. And then instead of categories map being an object, categories will now be an array. And then here, we'll just update this like so. So up until this point, just a lot of renaming, nothing really that different. But where this gets interesting is that instead now, select categories map is going to be something that selects state.categories.categories. And then we have to transform this array into our final categories map. So here, what I want to do is I want to take that logic that we had commented out, because this is probably where we're going to do that exact transformation that we had before. And that code lived inside of our Firebase utils. And it's really just this code right here. So I'm just going to copy this, get rid of this last comment that we don't need, go back into our category selector and just paste this in. So essentially what we're saying is, hey, give me the categories and reduce over it. Now, instead of a snapshot, we're going to get the actual category object. And then we no longer need to fetch off of the data because it's already the data. So we get the title, we get the items, we accumulate over, lowercase the title, set it to the items array. And now if we save this, what'll be interesting is that select categories map is something we're still using throughout the application. So this actually won't need to update wherever we're calling it, because now the selector still will work. Before it was just pulling off the value, now it's transforming the value. But what we want to do here is we want to just make sure that we're updating with the right call. So instead of set categories map, now we're calling set categories. Like so. And then categories array gets passed to set categories. And now if we save this and we go back to our application, let's just refresh to make sure that that error was not our error. But here we see, we call set categories. Categories get stored as this array. And then all of our components are still working because our select categories map code is still working because that selector is now transforming it into the categories map, which we can pull. So that's it. This is one very, very common pattern that you have to understand when it comes to using Redux and reducers. You can even extrapolate this when you call use reducer in your context, but it's a lot more clear when you actually write out the separated file structure that comes with Redux. The selector file is where this reducer specific transformation business logic is going to live. So one of the things that you may be thinking about now is that, well, Yihua, if every time we call our selector, essentially what we're doing is we are rerunning this reduce function. Is it not going to be the case that every time we make different calls, we are actually going to be re-rendering this reduce, which may actually prove to be significantly less performant? Well, this is actually one of those trade-offs that we're going to talk about in the next video. There's a couple things that emerge from this pattern. The main thing I want you to realize, though, is the logic of the pattern and the clarity that it brings, as well as the separation of the business logic. Whether or not this format is a little bit less performant than the previous one is a different question. We're going down this path because we need to learn this pattern, and we have to learn about why there are indeed certain bottlenecks that come. So that's what we'll cover in the next video.